part of our program today, which is, in a sense, that it's a culmination, but also an opening for new discussions. So the plan here is we will have our final reflections, and that will be followed, we hope, by a substantial amount of time for questions for our last two speakers, but also for discussion with our panelists from today. And so I'm going to ask all of the speakers from today to come up here when the comments are over, so we can have, hopefully the speakers can speak to one another as well as to all of us. And we can have a fruitful and end of conference discussion. So now I'll hand over the microphone to our final panelists.
Thank you very much. I teach a class in Harvard Divinity School titled Christianity and Civil Society in Africa. And the most difficult part of it is dealing with North African Christianity. I think this conference has allowed us to recognize that there's so much to learn from that period. And I'm hoping that somehow we will be able to get some money to bring some of you back for the sake of our students, so that we can have series of lectures relating to that whole region and invite our students to sort of listen to these very, very fascinating conversations that we have been listening to. So it's not just for us, but also for the larger community. That's going to be my wish. And those who control the folks, they are all here, so I don't have to say more than that. So thank you very much. I'd like to welcome us to the last section of this very, very fascinating conference. And we have with us two highly distinguished scholars who are going to give us some reflections on what we have been hearing and the conversations that we have taken place since yesterday. The first person is Professor Christopher Eheret. He's a distinguished research professor in the Department of History at the University of California at Los Angeles. His research over the past 4 decades has dealt with a variety of topics relating to African historical and cultural areas and a wide range of time periods. A long-running focus in his research has been on understanding the ways cross-cultural interactions have shaped the causes of long-term social, cultural, and economic change across the continent. He has also worked especially on developing the tools and techniques for reconstructing history. And just now, he was talking to me about some of the collaborative research that he's also doing with some of our younger scholars. So we want to welcome you to this section. The second speaker is Professor Helen Evans. And he's the Mary and Michael Jaharis Curator for Byzantine Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Arts in New York. In addition to her groundbreaking work on the art and material culture of the Byzantine world, exemplified in the 2 volumes she published, The Glory of Byzantium, 1997, and Byzantine Faith and Power, 2004, and Byzantine and Islam, 2012, she has played a critical role in developing the Met's collections of early Christian and early Jewish arts and demonstrating the central place of Byzantine art and culture within the Mediterranean world and beyond. So please join me in welcoming both scholars to the last section. Thank you very much. Welcome.
Well, since I had been scribbling things as I sat through the day, I may we hope that I will be coherent and continue on topic, but I may suddenly discover, oh, I put in something else I forgot I put in. So I set up a kind of some kind of a PowerPoint ahead of time, which therefore the materials that we will actually use it for are toward the end, things that I had planned ahead to say earlier. But the appropriation and adaptation here is thinking about the topic that's come up very much so in the second half today, and particularly dealing with Congo, where we saw the appropriation of earlier religion, earlier cultural backgrounds into the adoption of a new religious outlook. And so that's what this is, adaptation of older ideas, appropriation of older cultural features into the new milieu that people live in. My real beginning comment that I wanted to make, and it's still quite true, is this is a wonderful event. I keep learning so much, and I don't want it to end. Could we please have another day? This is, yeah, just, oh. Anyway, one of the themes, and that kind of goes back to here, that it's always caught my interest when we get into religious history, is that it's a theme that matters to me more widely. It's the interface between beliefs and rituals of the former religious orientation of a region and the religion newly adopted into that region. What extent do people, in adopting the outward trappings of Christianity, appropriate and revision the sites of earlier religious observance? What kinds of prior religious, cultural, political views might have been blended into, or color or shape how these people express their beliefs in their new religious milieu? How does the older milieu still come out in the new one, and how they relate culturally and socially and politically to that new milieu? And these kind of issues particularly interested me because a major focus on through the years in my own work has been the reconstruction of how people in the past viewed their realm of existence, our realms of existence that we live in. How did they express and organize their understandings of existence and of things seen and unseen that they have to cope with as human beings? Now, something that came out already in Jacob's comments, which you might associate with me, is, well, one thing you can do is you can pursue reconstruction of ancient lexicons of all sorts of aspects of ideas, ideology, beliefs, and so on. And by reconstructing, tracking back the meaning change, the semantic histories, the sources, how far back in time those words go, this gives us information on what people actually believed. You don't have a word for something unless it's something that you culturally or in practical ways recognize as existing. So that's one way, but there's another important tack that's not much used, I think, these days, but it's also essential if you're going to use language evidence. You can independently uncover ancient cultural history. It doesn't give you as certain and sharper results as if you can reconstruct the lexicon of that ancient culture, but going back to comparative cultural reconstruction is essential if you're going to be able to correctly interpret the meanings, the implications of the reconstructions of words. You can't accurately interpret relevant word histories without understanding their ethnographic, their cultural context, and their meanings. I began graduate studies so long ago that you could still find a variety of mentors for all those sorts of backgrounds that you might need. I ended up at Northwestern at the right time too, where there were people that worked still with those kind of tools. The working with comparative ethnographic study used to be really important in anthropology, and it's kind of hard to find people that actually know that anymore. So I was lucky to get people there. I had mentors that were really valuable ones to me. You might know the name of Jan van Sina, which incidentally I got to do because our own main professor got ill, so I got to go up to Northwestern and take advantage of that. And in fact, I wrote my first published article in a seminar with him. But I got to study archaeology under Bruce Trigger, anthropology and anthropological methods for reconstruction of the past under Oswald Werner, who you've probably there's probably many people in the world named Oswald Werner, and you won't know who he was. But it was just a great time, and Northwestern at that time was encouraging, and people seemed ready to let me build my own program where I could be a sort of double kind of PhDs, doing history and doing language, and on the side doing the other necessary things. And I think to the extent that we can encourage this kind of background here and there, at least a few universities to continue, we're going to enrich what we can discover. So I want to return to the ideas of appropriating older things into new. Giovanni gave us quite an example, I think, the interpermeability. I thought of that up at that, invented maybe that term today, but the interpermeability of church and state. Is it separate? Is it all one? Is it even, it's an interlocked, inter-network situation. I think he brought that out in a way that certainly makes sense to me. And it looks to me, when I look back at the kind of reconstruction I would do of the political world of pre-Nubian, even back to pre-Meroitic backgrounds, that's the kind of world I would expect. That there isn't a separate ritual and religious sphere from a political sphere. And it's deeply intertwined in the ancient kingship of that region, that the king is tied into the religious framework and is a special sacred character within that. So that really made sense to me. Now, on the other hand, the encounter with a new religion can maybe change things as well, and Nubia gives us an example of that. Very abruptly, it seems, we have the disappearance of the older burial customs of Nubia. Kings don't get buried with people to go into the afterlife with them immediately anymore. We can't necessarily locate the burials well because they're not buried with tons of material goods like they would in the past. So you could have a religion in one way going right into the world, the cultural world as it's existed before, and yet some belief might turn out to be very important and change things. And in that case, that sort of a way. There's an example here that I could go to of a different sort of way that we see this. We got a student many years ago at UCLA, Gilda Nicolas, who was, he had left the priesthood. He'd been a Catholic priest in Ethiopia, but he was deeply interested in religious history. And darn it, I went looking for this article, and I'm missing my whole volume where this article should be, so I didn't get to bring it here to tell people. But please, if you feel like pushing me on this, within the next year I'm going to rediscover where it is, and I can give you this information. But what he did was look at the sort of ritual sites within the Ethiopian context. And what he argues in this short, well, that's a sort of medium-sized article, was the importance of rock shrines of one kind or another, cave sites, for instance, even, but recesses in the rock, as special ritual locations anciently among Agau-speaking peoples. And this is the heart of what became the early Ethiopian Christian areas. And then what his argument was is that Christianity appropriated most of these sites. What they become is sites of this saint or that saint. And that then he went on to argue that the Zagwe-era rock church building, it may be drawing models for the church shape from somewhere else, but it's building on this tradition, that it's expanding it in a new way. And of course, we do have the cave church there near Lalibela as well. So you have churches actually not necessarily creating your own cave as they do with some of the main church sites there at Lalibela. So that was an interesting one to me. Let's see, and rather than take you on to something that looks strange, why don't we just go back to my title for a minute, because I don't have the time to talk. Now, There's a different kind of case that I think we can also look at with the case of, with the instance, it's not only along the Nile, south of Egypt, not in Egypt, but south of it, but also in the Horn of Africa in the end, similar sorts of thing. The religious belief, the religion among Meroites and Nubians before Christianity, well, let's talk about the whole background there in the Sudan. The Nilo-Saharan speaking peoples over a wide area of what's today Sudan and South Sudan. Anciently, you get the testimony here and there in all sorts of ways, followed a belief system that one might think of as a kind of monotheism in a sense. But its God wasn't an individual, personal God. Rather, it involved an interpretation of the divine factor as a single divinity, a single condition, or a divine presence accompanying, underlying, or permeating material existence. Since the work of Godfrey Lienhardt, this is now 40 years ago, anthropologists, I find, increasingly seem to have picked up the idea of taking what he did. What he did in studying the Dinka religion was choose to translate this idea of godness or something, godhood, as divinity with a capital D. And nevertheless, this divinity could express itself in different named spirit forms. And what he found is that people understood these not as separate spirits, but as different manifestations, different ways in which the agency of divinity acted in our mundane world. And then there's a particular, you can always kind of locate where people have this belief because there's a particular metaphorical, natural context associated. Divinity associated with sky. So images with, and the power of divinity is expressed in storms and in lightning, okay, things like that of the sky. There's no sun god idea running around here, by the way. It's not the power of the sun, power of nature in other ways. And you find this as a recurrent idiom across the whole of a much wider area. So we'll take us and look at this. Here's some Nilo-Saharan cases to start with. I looked just at Nilotic branch, the first ones to give you, but what you have are words that express God, if they get translated to Christianity today, but you look into the ideas of these peoples, it's this divinity idea, but it's also very, very often, in some cases, it's specifically also the word for sky. So it's sky spelled with a capital S, you might say. And then you have a case like in the Auditorium branch of the Eastern Nilotes, where it has a little prefix, the A, and the nya is an additional prefix that takes the word above and turns it into a noun. So it's aboveness, something on high. And then here's the interesting thing for us, some of the things we've talked about here. In Nobine, the word for God can be tracked back to an ancient Nilo-Saharan root word. When you see funny things like capital O's, on this computer there are not the fonts that would make the right kind of funny-looking O, so anyway, it's just some linguistic thing that got messed around. But the source is an ancient verb that has to do with the being above. Maybe it's not clear how much it's a verb and how much it's a verb of state, but it's to be on top, to be above. And we can drive this, it has the right sound correspondences, everything to fit that particular word. Now, it isn't just the cases there that we've given. We can also, here's my speculation part where I have fun. The epidemic is very, very significant as what we outsiders interpret as gods. I'm looking at Meroitic religion and I think they follow divinity. And that epidemic is simply the very major hypostasis of divinity. But in any case, when you look at it structurally in Nilo-Saharan grammatical terms, Well, any word that begins in ah in a Nilo-Saharan language, that ah is a noun-forming prefix. And Meroitic was a Nilo-Saharan language. Mak is a word for at least a minor king, if not the major king of a Meroitic territory. And you're left with this couple syllables in the middle there, and that's where my speculation is. There's that funny-looking thing with the P-H-E-E, and then it goes weird. The weird is a particular kind of D sound in reconstructed Nilo-Saharan. So here's this word that's anciently to be above or on top. It's another word like the Ngor word that I already gave you. And hey, I can't know. I mean, maybe that paid is from some other Nilo-Saharan word and isn't from this at all. But it was fun to suggest it might be, that we're dealing again with divinity here, that's what we're talking about. It doesn't just stop there. That little apostrophe is what's left over from the sound you know, the high central vowel in Giz or in Amharic, the Menelik. Anyway, it's that's what's left over. The symbol's not there, I'm sorry. Anyway, in the Proto-Agau language, the word for God reconstructs as Dibin, and we can track it back to the various sources there in earlier Cushitic meaning not Kush with a K, but the languages of Ethiopia. And getting a long vowel from a short vowel, that's one of the ways you create a noun in early Cushitic, so from a verb. So you have the verb with the short vowel, and making a long vowel makes it a noun. So again, we have some kind of connection, and it has sky, cloud, and rain sort of implications. So, but it goes much wider. There is an early Cushitic ancient word, waka, which is an Oromo today. It is divinity and sky, and the anthropologists who've worked with Oromo religion separately from those who are Christian and Muslim, they see the same idea of divinity being key in their religion. And then you'll find in Somali still, if you do proverbs, people will use waq for God instead of Allah or something. They'll use waq in the proverbs. So you can see that anciently it was a word of theirs. And because of the southern Cushitic language, clear down in East Africa, we're dealing with a word that's earlier than 3000 BC. Otherwise, it doesn't turn up all the way down there. So we're talking here about some really ancient concepts. And what I'm wanting to see is, do we see these, are these turning up in some ways in Ethiopian Christianity? Are there varieties where we see some of these kind of ideas? Or if we look, of course, like to church foundations and so on, do we see more ancient Cushitic ideas, Agau ideas, for instance, getting into the history? So that's the kind of commentary I'm making. I see such good things. We'll go on and talk about Congo in a minute, too, where you have the same sort of issues. By the way, this would seem to be the more ancient word for some kind of divinity in Afroasiatic that goes back earlier than the ones, and it represents a very different kind of belief, not in divinity, but in some kind of more localized God. So let's get on past that, but it's not helping you any particularly. Let's get on and look at the Bantu case, because I thought I was really hoping and expecting I would hear, particularly on Congo, all these sorts of underlying cultural materials that come into there. So I think we can suggest similar factors too when we look here, that there is a world going back of religious belief going back in which there is something like monotheism. Now in ancient Niger Congo, you need to have the ancestors. They're the ones. God is a bit, maybe the creator, and this turns up in the mythologies all around through Niger Congo areas. But is somewhat of an odious God in most areas. He doesn't deal with us directly. It's the ancestors, and it'd be local territorial spirits. Congo is a very fine case of local territorial spirits as well, that people would go to seek help. And you have to keep on the right side of the ancestors and care for them. So that's more where the heart of religion works, and I think some of those things came out in what John and Cecile had to say. Now, in this case, we have a quite old word again. The Proto-Bantu word can be connected up to the sound correspondences to the extent that we've established them. It's MBs do produce M and N and Akan, so and the vowels tend to stay almost the same. So we have a case here, and here's how the structure is. You have the noun-forming suffix. You have a prefix, which was originally, and it is widely in Bantu languages still, a prefix of something animate, a living being that's not a human being. So God's not being treated, the Creator God, as if it's some big human being up there in the sky or something, or down under the ground or somewhere else. There is a potential verb that seems to lie in the middle of it, a word having to do with begin, which gives us a chance to say the word and the idea goes back a long time. Since Proto-Bantu is around 3000 BC, we have to carry it back earlier in time to have it also way off separately, preserved in modern-day Ghana. This is just to show you how widespread it is. Mashariki is sort of the narrow Eastern Bantu group, but that's most of Eastern Africa. You have a word that has something to do with arranging, putting things in order. So again, we have somebody who establishes order in the life. And this settlement in archaeology is hitting East Africa by 1000 to 500 BCE, so that we need to track the word back that far. And then here's some kind of local cases in East Africa where a different verb, specifically a verb to create or to mold a pot, is used as the basis for word for God. So this is a very recurrent thing through Niger-Congo world to have that kind of background. And so it also interests me on another side, looking at this kind of religious belief. This is imponderable, not something we can answer properly, but does this having something approaching a monotheistic view cultivate the soil for the new kind of belief system that is definitely monotheistic to come in? So I leave you with that thought. I think it's a fruitful and necessary approach, to me at least, that we undertake to understand the religion that was there before. Then it enriches how we understand how the new religion has come into place and how it's been able to succeed and what people do as they transition from one belief system to another. Thank you. So we need to get rid of this, don't we?
So I'm the art historian that's not got any slides. And I have instead a text. These were really wonderful talks today. And I hope that they will lead to fulfilling some of Professor Gates' ambitions. As a Byzantinist, I developed our Marian Michael Jaharis galleries at the Metropolitan Museum to present a broad-based recognition of East Christian art and culture, and will base my brief remarks, and they are brief, on these efforts. I'm not going to remark on the papers individually, but rather on general themes we heard that should be relevant for future study. First, every speaker has shown the relevance to Christian Africa of the larger world and Christian Africa's interest in the larger world. By making ignored or unknown art and texts known, the speakers are forcing new consideration of Africa's role in the larger medieval world. To reinforce Betsy Bowman's statement about the term Coptic, art made under the rule of New Rome, Constantinople at the Met is displayed as that of Byzantine Egypt, including elaborate gold jewelry and some important text. And the significance is to make people aware that Byzantine Egypt is one of the wealthiest provinces of the Byzantine Empire. It's not people out somewhere beyond. They are, in fact, central to the the whole history of the empire. And it might be relevant for the way we're discussing today that one of my colleagues will borrow the gold jewelry that we have that was at least claimed when it was sold to Mr. Morgan to have been found in Egypt in an exhibition next year on the jewelry that the Byzantine court would have worn. And it is of that type of luxury. It's not something that one would think of as distant and provincial. And I would like to thank Marie for including in her talk the Ethiopian manuscript that I acquired for our galleries to show that the Byzantine sphere does not orient only to Western Europe, which is certainly the way it was studied for many centuries, but is equally relevant to the peoples that it traded with that went as far as beyond the European continent and to the edge of Asia. This is an important issue and has been alluded to in the larger talk today about how the world received Africans. So I particularly liked Samantha Kelly's description of Ethiopians in Rome. And I would like to add one more example of contacts with the West, but my West, the Byzantine world, other people's East. But I began my studies in Japan, so to me, Constantinople is the West. It's on a Nubian king's visit to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. It's a variation on Giovanni Ruffini's remarks. The crusader, Robert de Clary, wrote The Conquest of Constantinople in describing much of the world the Western forces had occupied in 1204. And the relevant entry for us is several paragraphs on how the barons came to the palace, and a king came there whose skin was all black, and he had a cross in the middle of his forehead that had been made with a hot iron. This king was living in a very rich abbey in the city, which the former emperor, having been deposed by the Crusaders, Alexius, had commanded that he should have and be lord of for as long as he wanted to stay there. And when the emperor saw him coming, he rose to meet him and did great honor to him. And the emperor asked the barons, "Do you know who the man is?" "Not at all, sire," said the barons. "Faith," said the emperor, "this is the king of Nubia, who has come in pilgrimage to this city." And then they had the interpreter talk with him, and he answered the interpreter in his own language that his land was 100 days' journey still beyond Jerusalem, and that he had come from there to Jerusalem on pilgrimage, and that when he set out from his land, he had fully 60 of his countrymen with him. And when he came to Jerusalem, there were only 10 of them alive, and when he came to Constantinople, only 2 were alive. And he said that he wanted to go on to pilgrimage to Rome, and from Rome to St. James, and then come back to Jerusalem, if he should live so long, and there die. And he said that all the people of his land were Christians, that when a child was born and baptized, they made a cross in the middle of his forehead with a hot iron, like the one he had. And the barons gazed at the king with great wonder. Now, this is not from one of the most finely edited translations. So while the footnote does say it sounds like it's genuine, it doesn't think of any of the ramifications of who he was writing it for or why, but it does speak of the respect that an African king had at the court in Byzantium, which I think fits in with the descriptions of the different trading centers we had today, perhaps particularly Cyprus. And it's not the first reference of Byzantine African connections of importance. In the 5th century, the Byzantine court had supplied naval ships to assist Aksum in the conquest of Yemen. Documents state that Byzantium, after the conquest, sent mosaics, a most elite gift, to decorate the church built in Sana'a for the forced conversion of the Yemenites, who gave it up as fast as they could a few centuries later. I am making this point to request your responses to a question of great interest to me, one that's become even more compelling after today's talks. What is the role of trade routes in spreading Christianity? And how does that bring Africa into the larger whole? I ask this in part because Aksum's conquest of Yemen as a Byzantine ally gave it control of the Red Sea trade routes to the black gold, the pepper, of Sri Lanka, which was paid for in Byzantine heavy gold solidi, which become the model for Sri Lankans' cheaper copper coins. And we can show that in what's been found in recent years, particularly on shipwrecks. Armenians have also been mentioned several times today, and by Stephen last night. And as I am organizing an exhibit for next fall on medieval Armenia, covering almost the centuries that you are covering today, I'm very aware that the Armenians and Ethiopians are among the first Christianized people, if not the first, and that they had, from the beginning, contact that continued on over the centuries, they're pretty far apart. They become Christianized in the very first decades of the 4th century, whatever date you pick. It's at the very early date. And to me, this is quite an important issue that I don't have a really good answer. I have not read anyone's answer. Why do two kings convert their people at the borders of the empire decades before the empire makes Christianity their official religion? They must have seen something or gambled on something that the rest of us are not aware of. And I would suggest that in part the two people are linked by the fact that they control the two major trade routes. Aksum controls the route through the Red Sea to India, both for the black gold, but also for the silks that come around on the trade routes. And the Armenians seem to be the linchpin that links the East and the West to get to primarily China's silks. We think of Christianity spreading with merchants and soldiers who would have certainly been in these outposts, the far western outports of the Roman Byzantine Empire, and so and to a degree also that which is the eastern outpost of the empire that opposes them. Why did people respond to them? Why did they convert and set into action the world that has been so brilliantly discussed today? I'm going to let that discussion go on now. Thank you.
Yes, sir, thank you. My motivation for the support, again, this was not my idea, it was Nicholas Watson's idea a couple years ago, and he came to me, and Larry Bobo is the chair of the Department of African American Studies, and this is how we do it at Harvard, or at least in the last 26 years. To create a position, an academic position, you have to create momentum. Even the illusion of momentum works around here. We start with a conference, right? And you get the best people you can get to come. And then maybe a lecture series. And then we go to the dean and talk about how irresistibly important and crucial and seminal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, an incremental position in the field is, and how important it would be to the future of liberal arts at Harvard. That's the model that we use. This is what we're doing right now. I've enjoyed this tremendously. Every paper, every response, it's fabulous, and I've learned so much. And by the way, Helen, where's Helen? Oh, Helen, I included the story of the visit of John and Linda and Chris were my main go-to people for the African civilization. So we debated that story, but it was so good, and I had a footnote that I said I'm going to put it in there. I hope that it was true. It is. It's great. No, that's wonderful. So thank you. But my motivation, again, is that Harvard have a position in medieval Africa that would be jointly shared between medieval studies and the Department of African and African American Studies. And this is the first step. And I think that we have every expectation for being successful. In wearing my other hat, which is the director of the Hutchins Center, I was very serious about encouraging research in this area. It's something I'm personally passionate about. I've worked on it from the literature point of view, and certainly from the history of art with the image of the black in Western art. Politically, ideologically, it is very important to me. I've already put my cards on the table about that. It's my mission. I love scholarship for scholarship's sake, but I'm a black man in a society that has historically been anti-black, and I have a powerful position, which I try to use for good ends, at least as I define them. And one of the ironies of this position is that something like a professor of medieval Africa contributes incrementally to defeating racism. It just does. It's hard to make that case if you're at a political rally, but we all know how phases of mediation work, how social change is slow, transformative, and you have to be a long-distance runner. And that's what I'd like to think I am, and that all of us are. So it's not so much as a question or anything. It's just to compliment you, to say how much I've learned, how pleasurable this has been, and to just say what our larger agenda is, which is to add a position in your very important field, either at the senior or the junior level, very soon at Harvard. Thank you, Sean.
And I'd just like to add that, to Skip's point, that in a sense this is actually step 2, because 2 years ago we started this with a conference on the TransSaharan World, which is asking similar sets of questions, although I have to say that my sort of response to what I've been hearing yesterday and today is, in a sense, I feel even better about what happened in this conference, because I feel like there really is, there's a connective tissue that made sense in a way in thinking about the problem, because there's a problematic, right, about the medieval as a concept being applied outside of its traditional historiographic realms. And there's a problem, and obviously there are problems with our other terms. There's problems clearly that came up in our discussions about what are we talking about when we talk about Africa. That came up last night. And what are we talking about when we talk about Christianity? I think also really came up, and it really came to a head, I think, in the final panel about Congo. Like, what are we talking about when we talk about Christianity? But I think the more that we can stretch and push and ask uncomfortable questions that maybe have answers we don't like to hear. Maybe someone will say to us, medieval Africa, it's a stupid idea. Well, that's okay, in the sense that I think it's good for us as medievalists, as the so-called traditional medievalists, and I hope we can get rid of that term. One of the goals of doing these kinds of events, and I think Skip would agree with this, is to rebuild and reconstitute what African studies is and what medieval studies is in a much more, I guess, capacious way would be the best way to put it. Yeah, an ecumenical way. And so it's equally important to us as medievalists here at Harvard. We don't have FTEs, we don't have appointment lines, but we do have a community and we do have a voice. And so I think, again, building up a sense of what we do as medievalists that encompasses more in productive and creative ways is really, really important. And I do think, too, that the connection that we're seeing here and that Helen really raised between the Byzantine world broadly understood and the African world, the medieval world as we used to understand it, is really something that's important to push forward with. And so I'm really hoping, and I really thank all of you for contributing to that and showing how that can work. And I think Samantha Kelly is a really wonderful example of someone trained as a Mediterranean European historian who now is opening the door to a whole new way of seeing her traditional area of study and sort of broadening it and making it much more lively. And I think much more revelatory than it might otherwise have been. So that's just my... my idea. Which idea? Oh, right. So we're going to the outcome of this conference. We do hope. Well, apparently it's not hope anymore. I guess I've been committed. Is to create a website through the Hutchins Center that will bring together what happened today and yesterday with the papers that we've been doing, but also bring into one place a sort of one-stop shopping for thinking about the big questions of medieval and Christian Africa. A place where people can go and sort of have resources and be led to other places and to sort of network out the really great stuff that's being done, but is often hard to find, and give us a chance to kind of bring that together and to keep these conversations going between scholars here and then the bigger scholarly community that couldn't all be here. We couldn't bring everyone. So this is sort of the longer range. And there's a book in here somewhere too. But I think the website is really exciting. And I think building this kind of virtual community is something that we really are excited about doing.
Yeah, you get the feeling that so many people, thank you, feel that they are working alone, or even within their universities or in their larger departments, that they, what do you do? Medieval stuff? What's that, right? What relevance does that have? And what I see, or what I hope to be able to help encourage, is the creation of community, the cementing of bonds, and the growth of a larger community. You could create momentum. It's amazing. 26 years ago, Harvard didn't even have African American studies in a real way. We had one professor in African American studies, and now we have 39. You really can transform an institution. You could transform a field. You just have to believe and have some resources, and that's what I hope that we can all do collectively together.
Now that we've rah-rahed, let's have some good hard questions too. Are you also, yes, Michael.
Thank you very much. I want to come back to what Helen had to say, because she brought these 2 points. Why convert to Christianity before the Byzantine Empire does? It seems to me that there was a lot of Christians around before the Byzantine emperor became Christian, especially in the East. All of Anatolia had been Christian for several hundred years, and the Middle East largely as well, and Egypt. So it doesn't surprise me that these peripheral countries saw the writing on the wall, at least, and they wanted, perhaps, to increase trade with this world. And that was the religion of the world. And the other point, the role of trade routes in spreading Christianity, there's another thought that's just come to me. And Mary Law, you might have some comment on this. It's about Lalibela. In Lalibela, this rock-cut center in northern Ethiopia, you have 2 kinds of rock-hewn churches. You have those which are carved into the rock, and then you have those which are carved out of the rock. In other words, you have monoliths. And it's my belief that the true churches of Lalibela were the monoliths. But they are in other words, and the other 6 or whatever, in fact, were attendant buildings which have subsequently been turned into churches. They don't look like churches, and they don't have the right kind of ground plan. But then you ask, why do you have these monoliths? Because nowhere else in the Christian world do you have monolithic churches? Nowhere. So where do you look for monolithic religious buildings? You look to India. There is an enormous amount of material influence, of material culture coming from India to East Africa. We see it in technology. One of my other interests is textiles in Ethiopia. And I'm sure that they get their cotton weaving technology from India. And I was just talking to some others a moment ago about their white garment that they wear is called the shama. Shama, I think, comes from this Indo-Persian word jama, which we use ourselves in pyjama. It means leg covering, pyjama. Jama means covering. So if we can look into the vocabulary which is used for this terminology, I'm thinking of Ethiopia because I know it better, but other parts of East Africa and perhaps other parts of Africa, we may be able to trace some of these origins. But I totally agree with you that trade has to do with it, not necessarily only with Christianity, because I think it's going both ways. It's going both ways. Thank you so much.
Give somebody else should just ask some questions. We can get, there's a rule. You get the microphone, you have to ask a question. Suzanne, sorry.
I was just going to pick up on these 2 ideas about periphery and trade, and I'm thinking about Geraldine Dodd's book on Andalusia, and when different cultures come together in that context of appropriation and engagement. And it also occurs to me that at the periphery, you have so much more freedom to do things than you do in the center. And so whether it's by way of interest or by way of their proximity to differences, I think that, first of all, I think that point was critical. I think the issue of technology is critical. I'm going back, just thinking about the work of Benjamin, I've forgotten his first name, where he talks about one of the key sources for the monasteries is India. And thinking about that as something else, we're not talking physically, but from the vantage point of the mindset. So I think that, and we have to think in both directions, because there are also African influences on India.
You can say whatever you want.
I had 2 thoughts. One, One is that I'm not sure that all African societies necessarily saw themselves as peripheral. And that, Ethiopia saw itself as a center, and in terms of certain kinds of trade, it was a center. And whatever sorts of freedom or choices they made, I think, had to do with their sense of themselves as being at the center of their own story. But I had another thought in terms of the future of the kinds of questions that we're raising here. Christian Africa is definitely what I work on, and I'm so happy that there was a conference devoted to this. But if we're thinking about medieval Africa, I think it would also be useful to think about Islam in Africa. And in terms of periodization...
That was our last conference.
Oh, okay. Because in terms of periodization, it makes a lot of sense in terms of sort of greater sense of connectivity across larger portions of Africa and its connection to trade routes across the world. And I think that those two things are so much in conversation with each other. It can't always, of course, be done in a single conference. But in the same way that we like to think about sort of both sides of the Mediterranean when we're thinking about the ancient world, to also be thinking about both sides of that religious coin.
Yeah, it's totally artificial and arbitrary to separate the way that we did. You're absolutely right.
But you just can't do everything in 2 days, so yeah.
Blame Sean.
Samantha, I only mean peripheral to the Christian world of Byzantium. Peripheral as a culture. Anyway, I have to get the question.
John.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate something that I said in my own talk, and I think it's moderately significant. I mean, in many respects, Congo or West Central Africa is a true outlier to all these other regions, because when Diogo's count sailed to the Congo River, nobody in the Congo River had any knowledge of the existence of Europe. And furthermore, nobody in Europe had any knowledge of the existence of West Central Africa at that time. It was equivalent to the discovery of the Americas for both parties. And as far as I know, I mean, although obviously West Central Africa has a hinterland which eventually will extend to East Africa, and therefore potentially there could be some sort of connection that way. As far as we know from archaeological research that's been done, there's no trade goods or anything that comes from East Africa to West Central Africa. So it is truly a new place for both parties involved. I think that most of the other areas, you could talk about them being part of a greater ecumene, even though the distance is quite vague. When the Portuguese arrive at, for example, at Benin, we know that Benin and the Niger Delta has been receiving goods from farther away, and that there's potential interest. One more thing to say is that in the Kingdom of Congo, they believe that when God created the world, he sent his angels to create every place else so that he could personally create the Kingdom of Congo.
Thanks, Sean.
Now I'm pretty nervous. Thanks. I've just, thank you so much for everybody who has contributed. It's been a really interesting conference for me, particularly someone who works from a slightly earlier field. And I've just been thinking about what you've been saying, Henry, about, the importance of identity, sort of particularly of people of colour. And I tend to work on a kind of literary representation, so work on Xenophon of Ephesus and Heliodorus, who wrote this Ethiopian story, and that got me into the Greek novels and sort of looking at early representation of Africa and their contribution to a kind of more wider sort of context. Whenever I'm giving talks to kids, because I did a lot of classics outreach, getting kids from various backgrounds into classics and saying they need to own that heritage, particularly the Mediterranean heritage, and saying that this is as much as your heritage as it is the Western people's heritage. So I was really excited to be invited by Judith to talk about the Ethiopian manuscripts, because it is my heritage, which I didn't know anything about, and saying that these were the earliest manuscripts, even in comparison to the European manuscripts, really, sort of reignited my interest in my own culture, but also of particularly thinking about our identity as people of colour, particularly in this modern kind of political context. So I'm interested in what happens after, today, and how we can perhaps move forward in trying to get as many people, the general public, the wider world, to think about the contribution of people of color and the various cultural exchanges that have been going on sort of Christian era, during Christian era, and so forth. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful from the panels I've seen today. My question is regarding whether, in terms of thinking about secular versus sacred, and if before, so I'm thinking particularly of the Portuguese, but when the Portuguese arrive in the Congo, if you found any kind of evidence of people initially carrying out secular ritual, secular activities that they then code as sacred in order to continue them. I was thinking about the Sangamentu, and how my understanding of the Sangamentu was that it was originally this kind of ritual, martial art, choreographic activity, but then Alfonso kind of recoded it as this battle between good and evil. And so my question is regarding these notions of like when the Christian Portuguese come, do things that were once secular then become kind of transformed into something that is sacred in order to kind of continue it?
Thank you. Yes, so it's a question about recoding and continuities and the porous frontier between the religious and the non-religious in terms of ritual events that are essential, in this case, the Sangamento that is essential to the affirmation of a certain type of political legitimacy before, as far as we know, the conversion to Christianity, and it continues after the conversion to Christianity as a clever way to bring things together. And I think that's one of the topics in which it is particularly interesting to start looking at it from the medieval perspective, perhaps, right? Where there is, at least in the methodology of the field, there's been a bit bigger emphasis on seeing the religious and the political as anchored together. And the trajectory that the Congo rituals such as Sangamento have taken really start in that moment of possibilities where the political and the religious are really imbricated together in a way that it was in Portugal also at the time, and then it takes on a different meaning once it becomes Christian, and then in the Americas continues on as something else. The core of your question is what strikes to me is an issue of where modernity comes into play there, that you start separating things that are not necessarily separated, and if you can use those terms for an African case where the chronology is not the same and the kind of the changes through time also take on a different meaning. So it's an issue of periodization, of methods, and also of methodology, I think, mostly.
Yes, good afternoon, good evening, rather. I'm grateful also for the conference and ways of looking at Christianity in Africa as a self-authenticating process, and something that wasn't coerced in any way. I started, my interest is generally in Ethiopian Orthodoxy and ancient Christianity in Africa as a way to refute a common conversation that has to do with the West, that Christianity is a Western tradition. And, but then now what I'm hearing more of, and I get asked questions about, is, well, what happened before? It seems very difficult for some especially African Americans or Western born, to conceive of Christianity as a self-authenticating, organic, happening process in the ways that we've talked about today, which is wonderful. So then I get asked, well, what was there before, and why would the Egyptians? Because the conversation about Osiris and the story of Jesus having been copied from, and all of that comes up. And I asked Giovanni earlier in his research, did he see any evidence of coercion in Nubia? So I guess my general question would be, has anyone dealt with what the conversion between, or what happened in the transition between ancient Egypt ideologies and the Coptic or the ancient Egyptian Christian church?
Well, thank you for that question. My dissertation, which I submitted in 1997, I think, so that was a very long time ago, was on Egyptian Christian depictions of the nursing Virgin Mary. And one subject that's always been raised with respect to that topic is the relationship between images of Isis nursing Horus and other Egyptian goddesses nursing the young pharaoh and their own children, et cetera. What the relationship of that culture was to the images of the nursing Virgin Mary. And when I wrote that dissertation, I bought the line that Egypt was cut off from the rest of the early Byzantine world. And so I concluded that the Egyptian Christian configuration of meaning for the nursing image was distinctly different from that of the rest of Byzantium. And I also divided the Miaphysite pro-Chalcedonian situation. I divided it more emphatically. I also bought the line that Egypt was exclusively Miaphysite. And of course now, after many, many years, I'm not sure about either of those things. So I think that it's very likely that the intense Egyptian focus on goddesses' milk as a substance that provided the pharaoh with the authority to rule along with other kinds of things. So it was arguably the most powerful substance in creating a pharaoh and his ability to keep the balance of the universe together. It's arguably the case that Egyptian Christians within that kind of historical environment, and there was certainly an overlap, of course, between pagan beliefs and Christian beliefs, that they reconfigured the nursing virgin to see the milk as powerful because of the Egyptian context. But I also now, so many years later, question how viable that is. And so I don't have an answer to your question, and I'm sorry I'm rambling a little bit because I'm very tired. But I think that there must be some kind of way that we can approach these kinds of questions on a micro level, I would say, not on a kind of universal level. That's, yeah.
Thanks. So one of the things, just sort of randomly off your question, when Clement of Alexandria wrote Stromata, which was a work that was intended to address the question of Greek philosophy in particular, but also Egyptian philosophy, he spends a great deal of time, talking about why the Greeks have it wrong. And then when he comes to the Hermetic philosophy, which was basically sort of Hermes had been identified as Thoth, and it sort of was the surviving form of that mode of thought, he says, and the books of Thoth are 45, and he goes on and has actually nothing bad to say about them at all. In fact, he doesn't spend very much time. It's like, here's the real truth. So, I mean, I think, now, obviously, Clement's point of view ultimately didn't make it. But I think we have to recognize that what's going on in this process is that Christianity is sort of, it takes a long time for Christianity to take all of its forms. It's sort of, if you imagine like the Big Bang Theory, and sort of all this matter comes out and then gradually swirls come around and form here and there. There was a potential swirl there in Egypt which I don't think necessarily bore much fruit beyond that, because ultimately these ideas didn't come forward. But I think that what Samantha was saying about the nursing virgin is kind of the same sort of thing. Sometimes it comes in. I mean, there was a question of the nursing virgin in terms of Theotokos and the Mother of God, that sort of thing. Although, when this was being discussed, they weren't talking about Egypt exactly. But then Theotokos and Mother of God, that's like the same epithet that you get for Isis. So, I think there's a lot there, and people haven't teased that out as much as maybe they can.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question since I have the microphone, and it's for everybody here, and it's about a concept that in the history of religion, the history of Christianity, is a fraught concept, but it's one it's of course because we use it all the time and we lean on it, and it's the problem of conversion. And I was curious about thinking about the case of Christianity, of African Christianity, in all of these different iterations. One of the things that's fascinating about conversion as a concept, however we see it, as a process or as an event or whatever, is the problem of when does it stop? And I'm always struck by, I work in Western Europe, but I'm always struck by how long conversion goes on. There's this idea that Europe is converted somehow, right? Augustine comes and converts England, or somebody goes and converts the Germans, but then somebody goes and does it again. So Boniface goes again to Germany and converts them, but then again they're converting, then Charlemagne's converting the Saxons. So it always seems to be going on. So there's a real question about, it's like a parallax problem, like where are you standing sort of determines whether, is conversion ever over with in a religious tradition like Christianity, or any religious tradition. And I'm kind of curious about how you see that problem in your own work as you look at Christian Africa or African Christianity. Like, how does conversion play in for you? Like, where does it happen? Does it end? Where does it start? How do you know it's going on? Because I was thinking about the Nubian case as an interesting one, right? Like, in a sense, like when you talk about embedded Christianity in the sense of an embedded economy, it's hard to see not only where it starts, but like if it's even there, right? It just becomes, when it becomes naturalized, then it becomes ideology in the purest sense. And then I don't think, do you have conversion anymore? Conversion requires distance of some sort, so.
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought of this before you raised this question. I find Catherine Bell's ritual theory approaches incredibly generative. And doing recent work on monasticism, I was working on a very short introduction on monasticism. I had to define it, working cross-culturally. And one of the ways I drew on her work to do that, to talk about strategic acts of differentiation. That is to say, ways in which our ritualized actions differentiate themselves strategically from non-marked actions, and how other ritually marked actions can differentiate themselves from other ritual actions. It's a kind of continual regression. And that monasticism is on many levels engaged in those processes, through withdrawal, through renunciation, through different forms, embodiments of monasticism, from sort of solitary forms to communal forms. And one could actually, I think of conversion in that sense. That is to say, conversion was not simply a mental exercise, but it was embedded in ritual practices that differentiated, often on the very micro level, right? I mean, there were certainly practices that continued and were shared, and yet they were also tweaked. Talking about sort of appropriations, right? Adaptations. And one could even think of monasticism itself as a kind of internal conversion within Christianity, vis-a-vis these sort. Right, and you had people who convert directly to, so I think that one of the reasons why I found Catherine Bell's work so generative is the ability to kind of frame those acts of differentiation in multiple, almost infinite sorts of ways, very productively within discrete social landscapes. So,
I don't know if I have an answer to your question, but both in the talk and in Chris Ehret's comments, there was mentioned the change of the funerary customs. So the funerary customs are a means of tracing a shift in ritual practice, at least in one of the phenomena that characterize religion, either in the pagan form or in the Christian form. So I'd say that for the Nubian case, there comes the moment where we don't locate any longer the royal burials. There is no funerary furnishings. There is a specific type of orientation and so on and so forth. And when does that happen to a degree that you'd say it's totally the case everywhere? When would you date that? I don't know, perhaps by the 8th, 9th century, and then you get some more important graves in Nubia of bishops, which then seem to get some furnishings again in them. Is that a pagan tradition that survives? Is that the multiplication of the forms of Christianity, like, for example, the mural painting that I showed from the annex of the monastery in Old Dongola? I don't think that this is not Christian, but it's Nubian Christian. So that's what concerns the end. As for the process, I think that there are introductions of ideas and a new faith that take the form of convergence of the royal court, the aristocracy, and then there is perhaps a sealing of these first contacts through what one could call the evangelization. But the evangelization is not the same with the Christianization, which is a much longer process. So there I have an example of a grave that I have excavated on the junction of the Nile with the river Atbara. We excavate something that we try to define with the terms Meroitic, post-Meroitic, and indeed all the funerary elements there seem to be the case. So you've got no superstructure because they are destroyed. The substructure reminds everything that we know of post-Meroitic burials, contracted position, with furnishings of the type you would expect, the pottery that you find in well-dated context from Gabati, just some kilometers down the road. And then, among this pottery, you find some that carry a Christian symbol, a cross. So, and that's something that happens on the junction of the Atbara and the Nile at the 7th, 8th century. So the process takes a very long time.
Just another quick response to the question of conversion takes me back to a moment in my graduate school training where my field was the whole of the world except Africa and except Europe and Asia, then primitive art. And I remember taking a course on shamanism, wherein the idea was that in the Americas and in Asia, one leaves one's body to go to that world to have that kind of set of adventures. Whereas in Africa and Europe, the whole point is to bring God into one's body. And thinking about so many rituals in Africa where on a regular, ongoing basis, one is preparing one's body for this in one way or another, and thinking about communion and other ways in which this takes place. And in Ethiopia, of course, it's even a good deal different than elsewhere. And I'm wondering if there isn't something to this about ongoing conversion processes within the rituals of practice in the preparation in a very bodily way that is different between Africa and Europe and historically the Americas and Asia.
Thank you. I will probably say that conversion is one of the most studied phenomena in the history of religions. Maybe apart from the conversations on God, the existence of God, I think conversion is probably next. And I'm referring to religious conversion here. I still believe that Robin Horton's essay, Theory of Conversion, is still one of the best, in the sense that scholars have found it to be so central to the questions of how and why Africans convert from indigenous tradition to either Islam and Christianity. And as I listened to Christopher's presentation on the discourse on God, very fascinating lecture that you gave, my mind kind of went to that in terms of how he talked about the microcosm and the macrocosm. The idea that the notion of the supreme God, has always been there. I think the mistake that theologians make is to introduce the word monotheism and polytheism in looking at that. If they have perhaps used the word worldview, maybe they'll probably have a better take on that. But basically what he's saying is that they have always believed in this thing. The notion of God has always been there. But like you said, it was a kind of I think you used the word Deus, it was a Deus Immotus somehow. And of course, when Christianity and Islam came, there was this whole expansion of space. The market economy, capitalism, and the rest of them. And so Africans encounter with Islam and Christianity. In it, they found something that was already there. It was latent, of course, in their own cosmology. And so that's why Robin Hutton will describe conversion as simply a kind of something that happened, but that was in there. The process was ongoing. But you are right that it is not, we're going to be talking about it till the end of the world, somehow.
Hello? I think that the evidence for conversion to Christianity in Nubia at the front end is not very good, contra Alex. I think that one way to get at the problem is to look at conversion out of it at the back end. So if you talk about the Islamization of Nubia, you might get some hint about what the process looked like originally to Christianity. So when you look at the Nubian families that first show up in the record as having Muslim members in them, a lot of this seems to happen through marriage. So you have these prominent women who end up marrying Muslim men for political alliances, for issues of support and contact with other powers. And then suddenly you've got Nubian kings who have Muslim nephews. And then what you think about in that context is these are situations in which nobody's converted. Somebody is simply being raised Muslim from birth. And as that process rinses and repeats enough times, you might be the last person left in the family to wake up one day and say, well, there aren't any more Christians left in my family. And yet there's no moment of conversion at all in that model. So if that's what's happening in the 1300s, it might well have been what was happening in the 300s. It's just a speculation.
Michael.
Sean, you were referring, I think, in Europe to the reconversion or continual conversion process. I think, well, I mean, we're not talking about polytheism to polytheism. Sort of the Romans following the Greeks. I think that what is very important for these modern religions is that they are, as we say, the religions of the book. And if you don't have books, then you're going to have to continue the conversion process. And I expect that what was going on in Northern Europe, for example, was that, as we hear from Henry of Livonia, they go in and they convert these people from the Eastern Baltic, and as soon as the priests go away, they jump in the river and wash it all off. You need priests, and as I say, you need the books. And this may be also why in Ethiopia, between the 4th century and the 6th century, we lose Christianity, because perhaps there were no books. I mean, now we've discovered some from the 6th century, but not many. And so I think literacy is an important aspect here.
All right. Yeah, I mean, briefly, I think I want to disagree on the issue of literacy as an essential factor for, conversion to even one of the religions of the book. There are, many other ways of transmitting knowledge. And the mestres, for example, that we talked about, although they were literate, I think the core of their religious message that they were delivering was very much orally. But the point I wanted to make is that, in a way, although that we're all doctors, I think we should resist the temptation of using conversion as a diagnostic, that it's, we can actually determine when it happened or even try to do that, right? And sometimes it's more, we're dealing with these big ideas and these big concepts. It can be more productive to look at actual objects or cultural productions that then can be analyzed and brought more broadly to the cultural context within which they are produced, so that we may not know, or it may be difficult to say that the Congo was converted fully in 1552. That was when the last one said his Hail Mary. But you can look at the objects that were produced and that that demonstrate that there were patterns of visual production and political production and artistic production that were in place, and then that demonstrate that something did happen that was significant. And whether or not it was by the letter of the text is not as interesting in a way than seeing a real concerted and lasting effort at creating a particular and set of visual and spiritual solutions.
I'm going to give the mic to Stephen, but I wanted to just throw into that. But again, I don't think I was trying to. The question wasn't. I was asking is more. Was this question of when does it end was more a rhetorical question, because it goes back to what Stephen said about, and I responded that conversio in the monastic tradition means a turning, but it's not a thing that happens to you, and it's not a thing that's ever over. It's a thing you have to keep doing every day, right? So it's recursive practice, which I think is an interesting question about if you think about that community-wide.
Yeah, just to follow up, so just to reframe the question, conversion to what? And part of, I'm now speaking out of the discipline of religious studies. That's my sort of primary departmental location. And there's been, in the study of pre-modern, I'm going to use scare quotes here, religion, our discipline's about what is religion and what do we describe as religious. And a lot of, like, for example, going back to what we were talking about earlier about the distinction between religious and secular is very much of I agree with you, a modern, or at best pre-modern, like early, not pre-modern, early modern distinction, right? And so, I don't know if you know Brent Nongbri's book, Before Religion, which posits that, essentially prior to the Enlightenment, there wasn't such a thing as religion in the way that we conceive it as moderns. That is to say, hermetically sealed traditions that are mapped geographically. You can sort of plot that out. And so, which complicates this question in many ways in terms of what do you convert to if it's not, distinct hermetically sealed traditions, which is why I think that embedding it, you were talking about visual culture, for example, ritual cultures, allegiances, running the gamut of what we would describe as political to religious, even though those distinctions wouldn't apply in the way that we apply them. So that would be I would just piggyback on the question in terms of conversion to what? What are we envisioning?
Yeah, and just briefly to complete that, I think it also implies a certain level of self-reflexivity that's either personal or at the level of a community. That is, it would be my guess, quite rare, right? That, in some contexts, yes, but in most contexts, it's not something that's part of the everyday.
Unless we bring Bourdieu into it, I do think habitus, in his sense, is interesting here, right? This set of dispositions that are again, they are recursive, but they're replicable through sort of a set of conscious practices as well as unconscious ones, and I think that's where, again, that's why I think the question of conversion, like you said, conversion to what, but conversion from what? Because there's got to be a turning from somewhere to somewhere, right? And if there is no there, then that becomes a problem. Yeah. Yeah, just spinning.
I didn't hear any of the lectures, but I just, as you were reflected in terms of conversion, I'm moved to think about Queen Jenga, a book, a biography I've just finished, and one of the things that her confessor and the Capuchin missionary who brought her through this process, at the end of the book, I included a poem that he writes, where in fact he ends by questioning whether she was really converted. And he said, in a sense, Jenga has cheated heaven. She has cheated death. Because in a sense, even though she had gone through all this process and built a church and all the things, and had personally, she wanted to be buried in a Capuchin's monk, in a robe, he really didn't believe that she had given up all of those traditions. But she was as pious, she brought all the women into all the things. She had made a complete turn. Now, I went to the place where Jenga is supposed to be buried in 2011, and the people who are now, saying they are the descendants of Jenga, they're called Jengas, they actually have rituals, which they do. And they go into this covered space where the Jenga is supposed to be buried, and they, speak in Kimbundu and do a religious ritual. Now, at the end of that ritual, they said, no, you have to come some other place in the same, come and see 2 other graves. And I followed them, and they went to another part of the protected area. You have to change. I couldn't go there with shoes or anything. Anyhow, they took me there, and they said, this is where the Capuchin are buried. And there were 2 Capuchins who died in Jenga's court and were buried. And it's recorded in the, documentation of this. And here are these orally transmitted. And the term that they used for Capuchin was, in fact, the Kimbundu term. And, it shocked me. I said, well, there's something, people may not, think that Jenga or people converted, but there's some elements of this sort of tradition that remain in people's mind. There's a memory, so I think we have to really, when we go to other cultures, think about how those cultures, in fact, receive, information, receive and practice and think about and indulge in, spirituality. Because that is the essence, your spirituality might be very, very different from mine. I grew up in the Caribbean, and, I know how my grandmother practiced it. She stayed in front of if she couldn't go to church, her Anglican church, she stayed in front of a window where she could see the church light on in the church, the Anglican church, just across, the wharf, and she followed all the prayers. Now, obviously, she's operating in a very different space, she had her Book of Common Prayers in front of her. Now, I wouldn't expect this of a Jenga, because she just refused to, let any let any Portuguese teach her. That's why she sent for Italians. And she dictated how her people should receive Christianity. She wanted it straight from Rome. It was also a political move on her part, because she knows if she let just ordinary Portuguese, priests come in, that they were in fact going to be spies for the Portuguese and try to take over her land. So religion is always tied to strategically with politics. And I'm not even saying it's in the pre-anything world, in the world. Today we see it right here. Being practiced.
Can you tell us who Jenga is?
Oh, they didn't know?
No.
Oh, no. Everybody should know. The greatest queen in the history of the world.
Oh, no. She was just an African ruler who ruled south of where that place that John works on, the Kingdom of the Congo. She was the Kingdom of Ndongo, and the Portuguese actually moved from their relationship with the Congo to Ndongo's area and conquered the place or attempted to conquer from 1575 until, in fact, I would say 1975. But anyhow, Jenga lived from 1582 to 1663. She outlived 10 Portuguese governors, so she had a lot. She knew the Portuguese very well. But anyhow, in the process, she did strategically convert to Christianity, and I believe in the end, there were times that she was absolutely the most devout Christian.
And in case you didn't know, that's Linda Haywood, professor at BU, happens to be married to John, and he's just published with Harvard Press, the definitive biography of, guess who? Queen Zinga.
Look at that, now they all hold it up like meat.
I would defer to somebody else if we're pressed for time. But well, let me just quickly say, with regard to looking back to earlier religions or traditions or whatever we want to say, particularly with Egypt, Nubia, any of the Nilotic cultures, it is impossible not to be affected by these. I think even today, anybody who's walked through Karnak, the homeland of the god Amun, is affected by it. And I think we can't lose, I think it's important not to lose sight of that these are monumental, beautiful structures that, whose iconography is often included as one of you showed with your with the monastery, but I'm also reminded of the tombs, particularly in the peripheral areas of the oases of Egypt, where you get in the same tomb both an Ankh sign and a cross, and in my own opinion, is that there was no problem with just taking on this new thing called Christianity, and it probably did happen gradually and without any kind of serious thought about it. So this is just just by way of urging you to look back at the standing Meroitic and Napatan period and pharaonic monuments, and I think you'll find a lot of parallels. I also, I'm not sure if this is the place, but I've learned a lot, and I think that people who deal with antiquity, as I do, and people who deal with medieval Africa have a lot to contribute to one another, and there's a Conference of Nubian Studies in Paris in September of 2018, which would, I think, would benefit greatly from having some of you participate. By the way, the conference is once every 4 years, so it's an opportunity.
You revived.
So working on Egyptian Christian material for so many years, I have become very sensitive to the use of the word influence, because most of what I read when I first started studying the material talked about the way that Egyptians were influenced by people from outside. And I've heard several people today use the word influence in a way that I would just ask us to think about, because influence implies passivity on the part of the party being influenced, and it gives power and authority to the entities influencing.
Oh, sorry.
I wanted to speak a bit about literacy and whether it is important or not, but then I'm going to start from your comment, because one of the things that we see happening in early and classic Christian period in Nubia is the appropriation of the space of the old Meroitic pyramids. And perhaps it's a bias of the archaeological records, but the way we see that happening is by the inscriptions that the people who appropriate this place are using in order to make it their own, by putting the monogram of Abraham in front of the mouth of the Meroitic queen, or by writing their name on the walls of the pyramid that they are using for X or Y reason, or by identifying a sitting royal figure with an appa. Now, okay, is there anything more to say about literacy and its role in creating new models of expressing the religion with the overhuman agents that one believes that populate the other side of this world? Well, yeah, there is. And this is, either you call it influence or agency, a choice of going out there and taking elements from another culture. On the level of politics that I've been trying to introduce in my talk, I think that still, at least until along the Nile Valley, Christianity was being played in the framework of canonicity of texts. And even the text that Giovanni tried to show as being singularly Nubian and prophylactic, they are not. Yes, they are Nubian, and yes, they are prophylactic, but you find them elsewhere in Byzantium. Same stories, same functions, inside graves, on manuscripts, on walls. The way we're going to be responsible towards the peoples whose stories we're trying to narrate is by contextualizing them every time in what was happening historically there. And I don't know if the methods and the way that I did that today were legitimate or not, politically correct or not, but I think that all these tools, call them religious theory, archaeological data, literary evidence, and theories upon them, are tools that we should be using.
So, go.
Yeah, I do agree that literacy is tremendously important, and absolutely, it's one of the, it's at the core of many understandings of, Christianity and what it means also, and that's one of the tools we should definitely use when it's there. I just wanted to react on the fact that is it essential, is it unimaginable to be Christian or to have Christianity without literacy? I think it is imaginable to have Christianity without literacy. So that's what I meant. Literacy is cool. Everybody should read.
But if you are, because I have the mic, if you are living in a world where texts are important, as in the papyri, then they continue to be. If you're living in a world where you don't have written text, then you have a whole another set of issues. And since I worked in an area for my doctoral work that was non-Muslim, non-Christian, and you could see how it works, particularly Islamic, through healing. So there was some young boy who could not be healed, no matter who he went to. And finally, he went to a Muslim healer and was healed. And so the conversion took place. Catholics throughout Benin and Togo and elsewhere were building hospitals and clinics, because once you've gotten somebody healed, and it's not necessarily taking on the religion, but you're adding kind of the cloak of that religious element to it. So I think it depends on where you are, and I think it does often come in through these other equally important things like healing and access to power.
I'm just going to yell. So with that, we're going to call this to an end. I still have to drive back to Amherst, and I might die on the road. But thank you all for